Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It's Tuesday afternoon, August 12th, 2025. And of course, the talk of the town, you could say, is this upcoming meeting of the two titans of the two superpowers, the United States and the towering figure of Donald J. Trump, and of course, the leader of the Russian Federation, President Vladimir Putin. There's a lot of opinions about why this meeting is even happening, what good can come out of it or not come out of it. And so I thought I'd just run through some of the ideas that have come to me, and based also on not on my own thinking about it, but also on what other people have talked about. So the first thing I want to say is that my initial reaction is, why? Why do this? Because the United States is losing this war. Russia's winning it. And, Russia's been down this road before. Larry Johnson has pointed out that in 2015, the separatists who had resisted the U.S.-sponsored coup, which follows the divide and conquer strategy based on the world empire. Whenever they want to get control of a country, they cause chaos. They create divide and conquer tactics, cause chaos, and then they get control of the country. And that's exactly what happened in 2014 with that coup in 2015. You have two major factions inside of Ukraine, people who speak Ukrainian, which is a relatively new language, actually based on various dialects of Polish and Russian and other Slavic languages. One of those particular factions had developed, and this was again nurtured through outside forces, nurtured this very strong ideology of Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian superiority, racial superiority even. And the U.S. nurtured these people for decades. They finally got control in 2014. They stage a coup. The U.S. stages a coup, violent coup. And when the Russian speakers, who have just been told that their language is now illegal to speak in the country that they built this country, and yet they're being told by this insane minority that they have no rights to speak Russian, and in fact these people are bombing them and strafing them and doing, committing torture and serious repression, and so they rebelled, and they were on the verge of wiping out these essentially fascist forces when Angela Merkel prevailed on President Putin to have a negotiated settlement. And years later, of course, he finds out that there was only a ploy. They were only buying time so that the Ukrainian military could be built up to be a de facto NATO power, and with the intention of provoking Russia, weakening Russia. This is all based on Zbigniew Brzezinski's grand chessboard strategy of destroying Russia by using Ukraine as a battering ram. And it didn't work out for them. And now they're repeating the same strategy, as Larry Johnson points out. They're repeating the same strategy of saying, we really need to have a ceasefire. We must have a ceasefire. I just saw a news conference with Trump, where he's saying, well, I'm going to tell Vladimir Putin he's got to stop this war, as if Trump is in any kind of bargaining position. So that brings me to the point of view of how delusional the West has been. Just a couple of examples. One is that they thought that they could build up Ukraine in order to defeat Russia. And what they didn't understand was that after, I would say probably starting in 2002, when the United States pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, And Russia said, please don't do that. It's really destabilizing the situation. What it does is what you're doing is you're setting up a situation for a nuclear first strike on Russia, and that would not with this anti-ballistic missile system that would prevent us from retaliating. This violates the whole point of mutually assured destruction, and so please don't do that. And the United States says, go to hell. And the United States has been telling Russia to go to hell for a very long time, starting with 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved voluntarily, and they withdrew their troops from Eastern Europe, which had served as a buffer because of the catastrophic losses that the Soviet Union had experienced in World War II. And so when they after the Soviet Union was invaded, and as I say, had catastrophic losses. They lost, 27 million people. I think 500,000 square miles, the equivalent of essentially the eastern. It was the equivalent of the eastern part of the United States from the East Coast up to Chicago. It was in terms of territory, and of course in terms of life and treasure and resources. It was, Russia was, it's a miracle, actually. Partly you could say it's a miracle, and partly you can say these Russians are really tough people. And when they're, what happened in Western Europe is when the Nazis invaded Western Europe, these countries fell in a matter of days. And Hitler thought, well, if we can defeat France in a month, and we can, walk over in Netherlands and in Norway and Denmark and so on, Hitler even said the Soviet Union is so weak that we can just kick down the door and the whole edifice will collapse. That was what Hitler said, and it's kind of interesting that the United States and Europe have the same idea. They think that Russia is inherently weak, and they could just attack it, and with sanctions and by building up the Ukrainian military, they would fight a war in the cheap. They would supply the weapons, they'd supply the money, which is printed, and they thought that they could defeat Russia in the battlefield, and of course it didn't work out that way. Now, of course, there are elements within the West which kind of foresaw that. Brian Berletic is one of the great analysts, and he points out that there was a 2019 Rand Corporation paper which talked about it was called Extending Russia. One of those components of extending it was using Ukraine, and even there they said this is a great strategy, but there are some risks. What if it doesn't work? Well, guess what? It's not working for them. So, the next issue is why Alaska? And I had this idea that this is the wrong place to have this meeting. First of all, it's very clear that Trump is asking for this meeting. So why should Putin go into the enemy camp to negotiate? This is not how it works. Historically speaking, I'm talking about world history. It's been a recurrent pattern that when envoys of one country go to another country and the other country has hostile intent toward it, which the West clearly does, that they're going to try and do something bad to that envoy. And there's a couple of examples. One main example of it is Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat, was negotiating with the Israelis and mysteriously died of cancer. And there's strong evidence that that the cancer was induced. Likewise, Hugo Chavez. He came to New York, gave a speech at the United Nations, and lo and behold, a year or two later, some kind of aggressive cancer happens and he dies. So when people say, don't worry about Putin going to Alaska because, they know that if they arrested Putin or they tried to physically harm him in a visible way, that Russia's got missiles and they never get away with it. But they have more surreptitious means of harming somebody or killing somebody than using direct open violence. So I had some concern about that. And one of the people that I also listened to is named Stas Krapivnik. Stas was a guy who was born in the Soviet Union, but again, like many Soviet people, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he went to the United States, and he had lived there for years. He was even a military officer in the U.S. military, but he saw what was going on in the United States, and eventually he just said to himself, this country has values that I don't support, and he's back in Russia now. He just gave a very very good discussion. He says he's taking a walk in the park with his dog, so mixed with his commands to his dog in Russian to sit or do whatever. He was explaining how he thinks that it's a really bad idea, and that they could seriously harm Vladimir Putin, and also Brian Berletic, felt that it's really a bad idea for Putin to go to U.S. territory, and I tend to think the same thing. The United States has a long history of malevolence towards Russia, and a long history of killing foreign leaders. And if you don't think there are elements, rubbing their hands together, waiting for Putin to come, looking for an open where they can do something, you're being naive. So I think Putin was being naive. And just now I was watching RT, and there was a Ukrainian Ukrainian person who's in favor of a resolution satisfactory to Russia, and he was saying the same thing, that he was saying something different, where he was saying that because Alaska used to be Russian. There's a kind of a commonality there where Putin's going to go to this place that used to be Russian, but now it's American, and now they're going to get together, and they're going to come up with great ideas for cooperation in the Arctic, and this guy, I think his name is Kirill Dmitriev, I think his name is, who's a Wall Street trained Russian who now works for the Russian, I think it's Sovereign Wealth Fund, is saying, hey, let's get together and do some work together. And so the delusion on the Russian side is that they think that the United States is reformable and that they can make a friend out of an enemy. And I'm quite skeptical of that. This is the historical record shows that sooner or later, even with the situation with détente, when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in 1962, there was almost a nuclear war. But JFK, John Kennedy, and Khrushchev worked that out with negotiation. And even though Kennedy was assassinated the year later and Khrushchev lost his job, there was still momentum that created other arms control treaties. Nixon went to Moscow and talked with Khrushchev, and they had arms control treaties. They had the SALT Treaty and the ABM Treaty, which was in 1972, which incidentally Ray McGovern, very famous, a great commentator nowadays, he's in his 80s and he's still giving great commentaries. He was involved in that negotiation. But that was in the 1970s. Then Reagan comes in. He immediately brands the Soviet Union as the evil empire. We're on the brink of nuclear war with missiles pointed at Russia, only 15 minutes away from Moscow. Moscow has missiles pointed at Europe. The peace movement in Germany and the peace movement in the United States were very active, and they basically said, you guys, knock this stuff off. You need to negotiate. So as a result, Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated a treaty to get rid of those missiles. And yet, Trump himself in 2019 trashed that treaty. And it's been pointed out that I think Paul Craig Roberts who's been around. He's in his 80s also. He was a Reagan era official, and he was pointing out that the United States has broken every single arms control treaty. So Putin is going there, and he thinks we're going to be able to negotiate something that, Russia has this characterization of the United States as being the literal English translation from Russian is non-agreement capable. In other words, they never agree. They never. You cannot trust them to keep an agreement. Ask any Native American. So, and for some reason, for Putin to go to Ukraine, to go to Alaska to somehow come up with a way out of this mess that the United States itself created, it makes no sense to me. And it makes no sense to me also because this whole crisis is an absolute product of U.S. rotten, pernicious foreign policy that's been going on since World War II. They've always had it in for the Soviet Union and now Russia. That has been the dominant vector of U.S. foreign policy, despite periods of détente. And in Russia's tried on many occasions to kind of mitigate that, and they've always had the door slammed in their face. So why should Putin go to Ukraine? Go to Alaska? My opinion is that Putin should say to Trump, yeah, it's really, really nice that you want to have peace, and you're telling me that I have to stop the war which you started. So if you're really serious about it, you come to Russia. And I suggest that you come to Stalingrad, where the United States has no idea of what went on during World War II. And if he goes to the Stalingrad Museum, he will see that Russia lost 1.1 million people killed, wounded, or captured, and the Germans lost, 500,000 people, plus 300,000 that were captured when the Soviet Union finally gave the Nazis their first really, really big defeat, which earned a letter of praise by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who said to the Soviet Union, you guys turned the war around. But in the United States, you don't know any of this stuff. So, Larry Johnson again recently said, Putin knows history, Trump does not. And because Trump does not know history, he doesn't know the past, he doesn't even know the present. And yet, why is Putin being so solicitous to this guy? It doesn't make any sense to me. There's the easy way and the hard way to learn. The easy way is where you discuss with somebody and you understand their point of view, and then you say, yes, now I understand. Okay, I will be reasonable. The hard way is what the Nazis and the Japanese, what happened to them. They picked their fight. They, caused catastrophic losses. Specifically, the Germans caused catastrophic losses throughout Europe, and they provoked the Soviet bear, the Russian bear, and Russia, after kicking all these forces out of Soviet territory, marched on Berlin and took over Berlin, and the Germans had nothing to say about it. At a certain point, when the Russians had actually entered into Berlin, the chairman, the head soldier of the German military, Keitel, said to Chuikov, who was the general in charge at that point, he says, well, we need to negotiate a ceasefire. And Chuikov said, forget about it. We won. You lost. Tough blankety blank. But see, the United States simply doesn't, they cannot do that. They just don't get it. So let me continue with some other things here. Um, yeah, if he were gonna, if even if Trump didn't go to Stalingrad, which is right in the heart of the Russian Federation, he could, if in the same spirit of just, if Putin is going to go to Alaska, why doesn't Trump just go to the far east of Russia, to a city like Khabarovsk or to Vladivostok? So he doesn't. He doesn't. Why is Putin going to Alaska? It makes no sense to me. I mentioned that Trump and the entire military establishment have been living in delusion. One of the main things I noticed, and this started when this war started in its current phase. Remember, it really started in 2014 when the U.S. coup regime started attacking Russian speakers, most notably in the city of Odessa, where they committed a massacre of probably at least 50 people, probably quite a lot more, of Russian speakers who resisted this Nazi coup. And so this whole war, started actually in 2014, but in 2022, when it became very clear that Ukraine was on the verge of, they actually had increased artillery attacks on the city of Donetsk and Lugansk and areas of eastern Ukraine. They had been violating the ceasefire that was negotiated in 2015 in the Minsk agreements. They were averaging around 40 shells a day. You can imagine you're living in a city, and periodically you get artillery shells, and you might get a little bit irritated about that. But what if it increased to 1,500 shells a day, and you can see movements of the military to attack your city? What would you do? So Russia, finally listened to the appeal of the people in Donetsk and Lugansk in the Donbass, and they preemptively attacked the Ukraine in order to prevent a massacre of the people living in eastern Ukraine. That was what this whole war has been about. And of course, I have friends call me and say, Eric, why did Russia invade Ukraine unprovoked? And don't they know that Russia's going to lose? And I was saying in 2022, guys, you don't know what you're talking about. Russia had to fight this war because it was an existential threat to Russia's existence. The U.S. wants to destroy Russia to get control of its resources. That's the story. Wall Street needs free stuff, and the way you get it is to steal it from somebody who's weaker than you. And to their surprise and shock, to their shock and awe, Russia proved to be far stronger than they expected. And now they're pleading, for some way out. And Trump is saying, oh, we need to negotiate something. No, we don't need to negotiate anything. So, why are they even doing this? The question is, what happens when Trump meets Putin and he says, as he was in a news conference, he says, I'm going to meet Putin and I'm going to tell him that he needs to stop fighting. This is not acceptable. And what's going to happen when Putin says to him, Donald, you're a great guy. I really like you a lot, but you got shit for brains. You screwed up big time. You bragged about sending Javelin missiles and destroying the Nord Stream pipeline, whether or not you did it. But you brag about provoking that war. You brag about equipping the Ukrainian military, and now they were beating the crap out of you. You're telling us that we need to stop our offensive, our counteroffensive against your nefarious plans? How is Putin going to address this this delusion of Trump. Um, People talk about this as a meeting of two world leaders. I see it more like as the meeting of a psychiatrist dealing with a schizophrenic, abusive, mental case. Because it's not like Trump is the only one. The entire leadership of the United States is like that. Trump said something like, um, the reason why, Russia's winning, Russia's doing very well here, because, Russia's a country it's at war. It fought Napoleon in one, it fought the Germans in one, and they're a very warlike country. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but that's what he said. And he forgets the fact that it's the United States has been at war for 90% of its existence. And who have they been fighting? They've been fighting the Indians, who were technologically no match for the United States. They fought the Spanish and the Mexicans, who were nowhere near strong enough to be able to withstand them. They fought in World War I when the countries that were fighting in World War I had already, their armies were already exhausted, and then the U.S. sweeps in with fresh military, and they win the day, and they think they're a really great economic military power. Smedley Butler, who was a highly decorated Marine, talked about being a gangster for capitalism. He was going into country after country, but these countries are incapable of really fighting back. And then in World War II, which the United States claims to have won, it was the Soviet Union that defeated 80% of the Wehrmacht, of the German, not just the German military, but the SS. These are the most violent and brutal of the German military at that time. And the Russians basically destroyed their military. So when England and the United States landed in Normandy, they were facing a depleted Nazi force. So and since then, they fought Korea. They couldn't defeat Korea and the People's Republic of China, which was technologically backward and devastated after World War II. They couldn't defeat them. They couldn't defeat in Vietnam. They couldn't defeat Afghanistan, and then Trump goes to says to Putin, you better comply with our demands or else something bad is going to happen. This is complete delusion, and the question is, what are they going to do about it? What is going to be the reaction? The EU is the same. They're in the same position. The EU, these are the inheritors of the imperialist, colonialist powers who were the bane of the planet for 500 years, and one of their big hatreds is for Russia. When the Soviet Union was invaded in World War II, it wasn't just Germany that invaded. It was Hungary, which is now neutral, you can say, but Romania, Italy, Finland, Bulgaria, Romania. These are all NATO countries now. Isn't it interesting that the allies to the fascists in World War II are now part of NATO, and they're all chomping at the bit to fight Russia again? Is this a psychological defect in these people, or as Larry Johnson recently said, is there some kind of genetic defect or something in European mentality that gets them into these situations? Very strange. My last point here is that, which I've kind of said, but I'll say it again, is that Trump he's got an ego problem. It would take a real psychiatrist to understand Trump's mentality. So on the one hand, he's a complete braggart who's always bragging about all his great successes, but on the other hand, he seems to be very insecure. and he needs reassurance. So when so as I'm thinking, should Putin massage Trump's ego, or should he read him the Riot Act? And the Russians are very polite, but recently China, after being kicked around for a number of years, and you're seeing this with Brazil, you're seeing this with India, when the United States says, you're going to do what we tell you to do, and they're saying, hell no. And that's the message that I think Putin really needs to give to Trump. Say, it is over. You wanted a dominant dollar, and the rest of the world is saying you've been using that dollar to bully us, to maintain your privileged position for your banker class while screwing your own people. And it's time for you guys to eat some heavy pounds of humble pie. So that's what I think really needs to happen. But we don't know what will happen because there's a lot of factors that are at play here. So that's my little rant about this whole issue with these upcoming quote unquote negotiations, and we'll just have to see how it goes. So again, if you'd like to support my channel, I'd appreciate it. You can send a few bucks to me by PayPal or buy me a coffee, or you can do a membership on Substack. So thanks again, and I'll talk to you again soon.